Let's return to FRBR now. And remember that FRBR articulates these 4 user tasks, 4 things that a user might want to do with a resource or resources that metadata records should help the user to do. And so far, we've just been talking about finding and identifying metadata records and resources, and I've lumped those 2 things together. But now let's talk about obtaining resources or getting access to a resource. Now, the obvious thing that you might think of when we're talking about getting access to a resource is, does the metadata record contain a link back to the original item? And this record, which we've looked at before on Europeana's site, of course does. It has this link back to this record on the British Library's site. So I click on that, and it brings up the record on the British Library's site. And the metadata record on the British Library's site has this cool viewer here. And let me show you that. Click on Interactive Zoomable Image. And it brings up this viewer where I can zoom in on this particular watercolor and zoom around and take a look at some of the details of the painting. Now, obviously, this is not the original item. The original item is a watercolor that lives in the British Library somewhere. But for most of us who aren't art historians, this interactive zoomable image is probably going to be good enough. The question is, if you actually are an art historian, can you use the British Library's metadata record to get access to the original item? And the answer is yes, you can. If I click on More Metadata, you get shelf mark right here. I don't know how to interpret a British Library shelf mark. I've simply never had a reason to learn, never having done research at the British Library. But I do know that the British Library has a very well-developed system for assigning shelf marks. So using that number, you could figure out where in the British Library's collection that particular watercolor lives. Presumably you would have to go to London to see it, and you would probably have to get permission from the British Library to take it down off the shelf or out of whatever box it's in. But if you had a reason to, you could potentially get access to the original item. So the question is, what do we mean by obtaining a resource? For some purposes, obtaining a surrogate of the resource is going to be sufficient. I, for example, am perfectly happy with a zoomable image of that particular watercolor because I do not have any need to put my hands on the original item. I'm perfectly happy being able to zoom in on details and exploring the resource that way. But an art historian might, for whatever reason, need to hold the original item in her hands. So does a metadata record help the user, whoever the user is and whatever their intended use is, does a metadata record help a user obtain a resource or whatever transformation of that resource is going to be acceptable? And so finally, we come to selecting a resource. The idea is, when you do a search using any kind of a discovery tool, you're going to retrieve a set of resources, or at least links to those resources. Think of the kind of results you get back when you use a search engine. And the metadata records for that set of resources should help you to select the ones that are going to be relevant to you or useful to you. Again, think of search engines. When you do a search, you're likely to get back thousands, if not millions, of links to resources, and you should get back some metadata, some information about those resources that will help you select the ones that are going to be most useful to you. And so we come full circle back to where we started at the beginning of this unit, and frankly, where we started at the beginning of this entire course. Because while metadata is over here, people's judgments about the usefulness of information resources and the relevance of information resources is over here. In other words, people's uses of information resources is related to, but it is separate from, the creation of metadata and the evaluation of metadata. And honestly, I'd argue that people's uses of information resources is actually the bigger picture. We create and consume information all the time. Human beings are just living in an environment of information. And metadata, as important as it is only a tool. It is only a means to an end. That end being, I would argue, use of information resources to fulfill whatever information needs we have as information-hungry human beings. So, how do you evaluate metadata? How much metadata is enough? And the answer is, of course, it depends. The answer is going to be subjective. The answer is going to be use-specific. Now, of course there are, commonalities and patterns across people in how people use information resources, in how people make judgments about usefulness and relevance. Of course, there are things that are shared across people. Everyone is a unique and special snowflake, but only up to a point. But, of course, that gets us into studying people's interactions with information objects and information technology. It gets us into this quadrant of this diagram here, which, I'll be honest with you, is way beyond studying metadata schemas and metadata records. So here's the thing about information science. One of the things that I personally find most interesting, although maybe this is the case for every field of study, I don't know, you can focus on one piece of the puzzle, one area, but eventually, for that area to make sense, you have to move out beyond that one area. You have to zoom out and look at the bigger picture. And personally, I think that evaluation is often where that happens, where that zooming out to look at the bigger picture happens. Because once you start thinking about criteria for evaluating something, for making a determination of whether something is successful or not, you often get into issues that are beyond the relatively narrow scope of what you're looking at. You have to look at criteria that serve the larger function, that feed into the bigger picture. So, how do you evaluate metadata? Well, you have to ask, does it help people discover resources? Does it help people make better use of resources? And you can define better however you like. You can define use however you like. And in light of the semantic web and the fact that semantic metadata is intended to not just be used by humans, but to also be used by software agents, you can define people however you like.